In this unit, we're going to learn about virtualization by using two desktop virtualization software packages. One is going to be Oracle VirtualBox, and the other one's going to be VMware Workstation. Those are probably the two of the most common, probably two of the most common when you're watching this video, although that might change over time, but they're certainly very common right now. So it's a good choice for us to look at how these two different platforms work. The basic goal of this course is that you're going to understand, hopefully, by getting our hands dirty with these desktop virtual environments, you'll understand the basics of how, some of the features available to us through virtualization and kind of build that baseline of understanding virtualization. And then when we get to virtualization in the data center, we obviously can't build virtual data centers in this course, but there are some labs through VMware that we can use to do that. So we'll learn about those through labs in VMware, but hopefully this will give you some context for that. And then finally, we do a cloud deployment when we learn about the cloud in the first part of this course in the first 5 weeks. Then we concentrate on security in the last part of the course. So let's talk about Oracle VirtualBox. Basically, in this presentation, I want to talk about Oracle VirtualBox, how it works, and show you some of the options that are available in VirtualBox and give you at least a basic understanding of VirtualBox so that you can go and run the install and build a virtual machine with VirtualBox and hopefully be proficient with it and have enough to get started and experiment with VirtualBox. So we're going to use VirtualBox 5. There may be a newer version when you watch this, but in this course I have it designed to use VirtualBox 5. You certainly could use a newer one if you prefer, or if you have experience with it, and feel like you can understand the objectives of the course using a newer version. So we're going to work with some of the menu options in VirtualBox Manager. Make sure we're familiar with how that works and some of the options that are available. And then we're going to work with a virtual machine in VirtualBox. We're going to build one and work with it and try to understand it. So first, installing VirtualBox. VirtualBox includes many of the same features as the commercial applications like Workstation, which you're going to see. But VirtualBox is open source and free to use. So you don't have to buy it. You just go and download it from Oracle's website and you can start using it. And certainly you could contribute to the open source if you wanted to, because it is an open source package. So installing VirtualBox is pretty straightforward. It's like installing any other application. You're going to have a window that comes up and you're going to hit next a bunch of times and you'll end up installing VirtualBox. So again, it's pretty straightforward how to do that. So on Windows 10, if you're installing VirtualBox in Windows 10, you have to have Windows XP or a newer OS. You can also do it on Mac OS X. You can do it on Linux. So it is support on lots of different platforms. But for this course, we're going to use Windows 10 to install our VirtualBox. I know some of you may have a Mac. And if you have a Mac, you won't be able to do this lab on a Mac unless you use the version of VirtualBox that's supported on Mac. And you're certainly welcome to do so. If you have a Mac, then go ahead and download the version of VirtualBox that's supported on a Mac. So creating a virtual machine after you install VirtualBox, you should create a VM environment for each guest OS that you want to install. Start the Create Virtual Machine wizard. You're going to click that new indicator in the toolbar, so it looks kind of like a circle, like a cog wheel. You're going to click on that. You're going to select how much memory you're going to allocate to your virtual machine. Then you're going to tell it how you want to create the virtual disk. So you're going to tell it what format you want to use for the disk. You're going to want to make sure you tell it to create the disk right away and not later. Otherwise, you'll have to create the disk, which is a little bit more complicated. So you're going to create the virtual disk now. You're going to make sure it's a file. And you're going to have to choose what format. So for this lab, we're going to use the VirtualBox Disk Image format, or VDI. So you're going to use the VDI format when it asks you what format. You'll have to tell it where you want to store that virtual disk and the size of the virtual disk. So the default name of the disk is going to be the same as the VM name, but you could change it if you want. But by default, it'll be the same. And there's also a default location, but you could choose a different location if you want, if you don't want it to be in the default location for VirtualBox. All right, then as soon as you create the disk, your VM will be created, the wizard closes, and it's going to return you to the VM or the VirtualBox manager. And the VM will now be in the list. By the way, this is the dialog box for creating a virtual disk. So like I said before, we're going to use VDI, but you could use those other formats, which we learned about in the previous unit. We learned about some of those different formats. One of the other options that we talked about previously in the course was whether we wanted to do dynamically allocated or fixed size. So you would have to choose. I would recommend for our labs just to use dynamically allocated. That way, because we're not going to use these machines very much, so they'll be relatively small. But if you do a fixed size, they're going to be pretty big, and we're not really going to use most of that space, so it's not very efficient. So some of the basic VM functions. There's two ways to start a virtual machine. You can click the Start button in the VirtualBox Manager, double-click the VirtualBox machine definition file in Windows Explorer. So before entering data, you need to click inside the VM to activate it to transfer the keyboard and mouse control to the VM. We've talked about this idea that virtual machines are sharing these resources with the host operating system. So somebody has to have exclusive access to the keyboard and the mouse. By default, that's going to be the host OS. And then when you click inside your virtual machine, that control is going to transfer into the virtual machine. It will now have control of the keyboard and mouse. And then you can always get control back. Usually when you click in that virtual machine, it's going to tell you that to get control back, you're going to click some combination of characters. I believe in VirtualBox, it's going to be the control and alt keys at the same time. So some of the basic functions for VirtualBox. As I mentioned before, if you click inside the virtual machine, you're going to want to switch control back to the host computer. So with VirtualBox, the way to do that is, let me click in here, is going to be pressing the host key, which is the right control by default. And I think there's other ways you could do it. So in newer versions of VM or VirtualBox, there might be other combinations. I think Control-Alt actually does work as well. To use the full screen for a VM, you can click the View menu and then go to full screen mode. So the problem is if you're not in full screen mode, sometimes it's hard to, you have to keep scrolling back and forth to work with your virtual machine. So if you're going to be using it, you might as well go into full screen mode while you're using the virtual, and then you can switch back by using the right control plus F to get in and out of the full screen mode. So some of the basic functions, in addition with the VirtualBox, you can end a session in 4 different ways. So when you're done using the virtual machine, just like a real machine, a lot of us are taught in computer classes, don't just turn the computer off. You have to shut it down the right way. So you could pause the virtual machine. So there's a pause button. You click the pause button, it'll sort of pause it in that state. So the next time you run it, it picks right up where it left off without having to reboot your virtual machine, which is nice. You can reset from the machine menu, so that will not do a clean shutdown. It'll just reset the machine, just like you would on a real computer. The ACPI shutdown from the machine menu basically is going to shut the machine down cleanly, just like you would on a real computer. If you click the power button one time, it will shut the machine down the correct way. And then you can click the close button to open the dialog box to save the machine state and send the shutdown signal and power off the machine. So that's the other way you could do this. So once VMware is installed, VirtualBox is installed, we have to install our guest operating system. So to work with a VM, you have to have a guest OS. Otherwise, you don't have, it's like having a computer with no operating system installed, right? So it's the same process. So to make sure that the VM is set to boot from an optical disk before the hard disk, otherwise it'll just try to keep booting from your empty disk. So we also have to make sure that we have an optical disk that has an operating system. It doesn't necessarily have to be a CD in your optical drive. You could also use an ISO image that's stored on your host computer and mount that as a CD or a DVD and boot from that. So here is the configuration settings in VirtualBox. So under System, you can define how much memory. You can configure that boot order that you see in the middle. So you can see in this example, it's set to boot from the floppy, then optical, and then hard disk. Of course, nobody has floppy disks anymore, so you'll probably just have optical and hard disk in there. So you want to make sure that that is set in that order. Otherwise, it's going to keep booting from the hard disk and not from your optical disk. So as far as the startup disk, this is where you tell it where your startup disk is. Again, you could just point it towards an ISO, or you can point it to your DVD or CD-ROM drive. Once you do that, you'll be able to click that Start button. It looks like an arrow up at the top. And when you click on that arrow, it'll start booting up your virtual machine, and you can install the guest operating system just like you would normally install an OS in any other computer. So the toolbar allows you to create a new VM and gives quick access to commonly used functions. So you can create a new VM, edit the settings, you can discard, you can start a VM, which we talked about before. The file menu has global settings for VirtualBox. So in there you can set your preferences, import an appliance, for example, that you might download from the internet. So sometimes you could download these already pre-built OSs from the internet that you can try for different applications and things like that. Sometimes there's complicated applications that are hard to install on their own, so they just give you a completed VM that has everything already installed and ready to go. Um, you also have the export appliance, so you can take a virtual machine that you've built and you can create an appliance out of that so other people can use it. You can put it on a website somewhere that people could download or something like that. You can change the networks, how networks work with your VM. You can look for updates for VirtualBox. You can reset the warnings. You can exit from the application. The normal stuff we expect to see in in any program in Windows or Mac. So here's a table. Oops, let me go back. Here's a table of some of the things you'll find in the file menu. So the machine menu contains options for the virtual machine. For the currently active virtual machine, you can create a new one. You can add a virtual machine from a virtual disk that you import. You can clone your machine. You can change the settings. You can remove it, start it, stop it, pause it, close it. All the things that we talked about already. Or discard a previously saved state, because they do use a lot of disk space when you create a state like that. All right, you can also show the logs for your virtual machine. You can show an Explorer, create a shortcut on the desktop. You can sort your VMs. So lots of different options in there that you can play around with. So when you start your virtual machine, the VirtualBox Guest OS window opens. It's going to show the desktop, and you use it just like any other computer, but it's just inside that window. So you'll start clicking in there to work with your virtual machine after you install it. For example, when you install Windows. For a copied VM to communicate with other VMs on the network, it has to have a unique MAC address. If you copy a VM, it's going to have the same MAC address until you change it. So you might have to generate a new MAC address or put a new MAC address in. Otherwise, it might, unless it's on a different network, of course, then it would work. To add an existing VM to your computer, you create a folder on your host computer with the files from the virtual machine, and then you can import that into VirtualBox using the Add menu. So guest editions are pretty important. I should probably emphasize this a little bit. When you first start using your virtual machine, you're going to notice it's a little bit kludgy sometimes. You're going to have difficulty clicking on things sometimes. The video isn't going to be so great. So guest editions make it easier to work with your virtual machine. So they make it so that, for example, instead of having to click inside your virtual machine to transfer control of the keyboard and mouse, the guest editions make it so that when you scroll your mouse over the virtual machine, the control is automatically transferred, and then when you scroll your mouse outside the virtual machine, it's transferred back to the host OS, all kind of seamlessly. So it makes it a little bit easier to work with it. You can share folders and move files between the guest and the host much easier with the guest editions. So lots of a shared clipboard, for example. So a lot of good little features with the guest editions, but you do have to install those. So after you install your guest OS, then you have to install the guest editions into the guest operating system. And you install those just like any other program. So with Windows, when you click the button to install guest editions, what's going to happen is VirtualBox is going to virtually make it look like somebody put a CD in to install a new program, and the auto run will run, and it'll pop up a window saying, do you want to install these editions? If that doesn't happen, you might have to go and look for those files that'll be in a virtual disk. In a virtual optical disk that'll appear in your virtual machine. You can also install guest editions if it's a Linux guest. So if you have a Windows host but a Linux guest, you can still install the guest editions, and it still allows all of these things that you see here. So you might have to install those for Linux as well. And we'll talk more about that in VMware, because in the lab for VirtualBox, we're going to do a Windows guest, but for VMware, we're going to do a Linux guest, and you'll see how to do that in Linux. They're very similar, VirtualBox and VMware. A lot of the features are very similar. So as far as transferring files, again, if you have the guest editions, it's going to make it much easier to do this. But you can also use shared folders. So you can share a folder, like use a UNC path, for example, between the different systems. So you would do that just like you would with Windows, with any other network. Drag and drop, however, is only going to work if you have guest editions. So you have to have the guest editions installed in order for that to work. Snapshots are used to preserve the state of your virtual disk, so you can take a snapshot of your virtual machine and save the state. So you can return to it later. So you can take a snapshot and then you can save it somewhere and then go back to that later. Again, I think I mentioned this before. It's great for software testing. If you're going to make a change, you can do a snapshot first and then you can go back to a previous version. If there is a problem, you can quickly revert back. So here's what the dialog looks like in VirtualBox for doing snapshots. And again, we'll talk about an analog to this in VMware as well in the other video. You can add or edit virtual disks, so you can add additional virtual disks, so you can have up to 30 virtual disks on the SATA controller in VirtualBox. I believe that's per machine, by the way. So if you want to add those, there's a dialog box. You can do that, and this is what it looks like in VirtualBox. Again, you might have to click around to find this stuff, but I'm sure you can find these options if you want to play with them. So creating a clone instead of creating a new VM from scratch, you can use a VM as a base and create a copy of it when it's needed. It can be done manually by copying the definition and disk files, and you can add them to the VirtualBox Manager. But you can also use the Clone Virtual Machine Wizard. I personally would use the Clone Virtual Machine Wizard because it'll change the things that need to get changed. So there's definitely good reasons to use that. For example, the MAC address will get changed when you use the Machine Wizard. That way you don't have to worry about going in and making those changes. So network settings, I think I talked about some of these before, but you've got a couple different network settings when you're working with your VM. You can have it not attached to the network. You can use NATing. You can use bridged. So the two main ones are going to be NAT and bridged. And like I said before, NAT is where your network connection for your guest OS is through the host OS. So it'll get an IP address from the host OS and then access the network, the local area network the host OS is connected to through the host OS. There's certainly reasons you'd want to do that. It's good for if you're doing software testing or security testing and things like that. And you don't want, or maybe you might have a virus or something, on your virtual machine. Although I would probably recommend not attached in that case. But bridged adapter is where the guest OS is connecting to the network directly, and it's bypassing the host OS. So they each access the network independently, which means that when your guest uses DHCP to get an IP address, unless your host happens to be the DHCP server, it's going to go out to the DHCP server just like the other OS does. And it's important to note that it is going to use a different MAC address. So it does appear as a completely different computer on the network. It doesn't appear to be on the same machine as the host OS. So I just want to make that distinction. So you'll see those settings in a dialog that looks similar to this. Also the adapter type. A lot of students, when they do this lab, they'll tell me that they can't get the network to work. And sometimes you have to change that adapter type and try some of the other adapter types before it'll work with your network. Different laptops and things like that are a little persnickety on the adapter type. So you can pass through the adapter that's on your computer directly to the guest OS, but you can also present the adapter as one of those standard types that are in the dropdown. So again, it's certainly something you could use to try to get your network to work if you're having any issues with networking. I would recommend for the labs that you use the bridge network setting. It'll just be a little bit easier for you than using NAT, but both should work. You should be able to use either one of those. So use this PowerPoint as a guide to complete the lab for installing a Windows guest OS using VirtualBox. And the links are in Blackboard to download VirtualBox, although you can Google for it and find it that way as well. And let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.